Hi there, it's Jorge again, and I'm bringing you our fourth and latest episode of the podcast here at UCD's Jean Monnet Center of Excellence on the new political economy of Europe. This is the second episode, and for the time being the last, that we've recorded in the United States. In it, the center's director, Aidan Regan, interviews Herman Mark Schwartz. Mark is a professor at University of Virginia's Department of Politics, but his background is not in political science. Instead, he is an economic historian whose research is geographically oriented. Mark's 1994 book, States versus Markets, charts the advance of markets and globalization since the 16th century. It was recently re-edited to include the rise of China and populism in the West following the 2008 financial crisis. Aidan and Mark begin by discussing housing and its relation to global finance. Most of us, when we think of global finance, we tend to associate it with, say, large international banks or Wall Street. In fact, however, housing stands at a critical nexus of trends that led to the 2008 financial crisis. Think, for example, of capital flows from supply surplus countries like Germany and China that fueled real estate bubbles not just in the US, but also in countries like Spain or Ireland. Mark also explains the architecture of global finance, as well as the US and the dollar's hegemonic role in what is essentially a global empire, in which, he points out, the US is the core and European states are, as he calls them, provinces. Aidan and Mark also discuss what viable economic strategies are available for the EU today, given this juncture. But that's enough over explaining on my part. I think I'll let you enjoy the interview and let Aidan and Mark do the talking.
Okay, so Mark, thanks for joining us here to have this conversation. I'm going to start by asking you about global finance and housing. You've published a lot on this, obviously your book on subprime. How and why does housing sit at the centre of global finance?
Hi, thanks, Aidan, for asking me to do this. Housing sits at the center of global finance in different ways, but we also have to say in different ways at different times. So basically there's three phases. And the phase in which housing was most important is the run-up to the 2008-2010 crisis. And the reason is very simple. Most European economies grow more slowly than the U.S., and to a certain extent, they get growth from exporting and having net exports, not simply exporting, but net exports. But if you're a net exporter, that means you're selling things and getting only money back in return, and you have to do something with the money. And if you go out into the world looking for a place to park your money, there's not that many places to park large volumes of money. So up until 2008, a country like China that was running massive trade surpluses, but also countries like Japan and Germany in the past, and the oil exporters, needed to park large volumes of the U.S. dollars they were earning. And they, of course, put this into U.S. Treasuries, which is one of the largest markets in the world, and they put it into real estate in the U.S. directly. But when all is said and done, real estate is the single biggest asset class in the world, and so a lot of money flowed into real estate. And in particular, it flowed into U.S. mortgage bonds because unlike actual physical real estate, which is difficult to manage, a mortgage-backed security is a financial instrument you can buy and sell. It's priced daily, and so it's easy to acquire and easy to get rid of. So the bonds issued by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and here's the important part, which at that time in 2008 constituted somewhere between 8 and 10% of the tradable stock of global bonds, naturally became a place for financial flows to go into globally.
Okay, so that's really interesting.
Yeah.
If I understood this correctly, you're saying that the surplus countries, the surplus exporting countries, have a lot of surplus,
yes,
and that goes into the dollar,
yes,
and that goes into the US system, which gets recycled back into the banking sector, which basically is lended out into real estate.
Yeah, but real estate in the form of mortgage-backed securities, which are a synthetic instrument that bundle a lot of actual mortgages, the kinds of mortgage that your average person buying a house has. Those mortgages are typically not tradable individually for various risk-related reasons and illiquidity reasons. And what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac do in the U.S. Is bundle these mortgages together into a bond that can then be sold in world markets. The Chinese were fantastic buyers of these bonds, but also European banks to a certain extent were also speculating with in this market space. So housing up until 2008, 2010 was generating an easily tradable piece of financial paper that surplus countries could park their money in, through a series of steps that translate actual dollars into this financial instrument. After that, things change because once the crash happens in the U.S., these instruments are damaged. People got scared of them, and so the money flowed back out of that into U.S. Treasury bonds. And some of that money has come back, but more recently, but that's because of the consequences of the European financial crisis, which we'll get to, I guess, in a few more minutes. But phase two was a retreat from these mortgage-backed securities.
I mean, that's fascinating because in a sense, it ties together the US, European, transatlantic banking finance system, but grounds it fundamentally into the mortgage market, into housing. So on the one hand, people thought, the subprime mortgage market, it was a US problem, it was somehow, but in actual fact, what you're saying is that this was all intimately connected globally.
Yes. In fact, the biggest buyers of the subprime mortgages, which are not the ones, subprime mortgage-backed securities, which are not the ones issued by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, but were being issued by investment banks and American commercial banks, and also European banks. The biggest buyers of those were actually European banks through offshore subsidiaries. And this is why European banks got damaged in the aftermath of the crash in the U.S. Had the Europeans stuck to their own business, as we say in the U.S., stayed in their own lane in Europe, they would have been fine. But because they were speculating through these offshore special investment vehicles or special purpose entities in U.S. subprime market, many of the big ones got damaged.
So in the aftermath of the crisis, so the Fed intervenes. The public sector, in effect, commits public resources to bailing out the private market. But simultaneously, therefore, the Fed is also bailing out the European private banking sector.
Yes. So I think people misunderstand what global banking looks like, and they think that banks operate inside what we can say the container of their national economy, and it's not that way anymore. Many of the big European banks and Canadian banks are operating in the U.S. So to put some names out, if you're a Canadian, you'll know that Toronto Dominion, TD Bank, operates in the U.S. Northeast, has a huge number of branches. If you're Spanish, you probably know that Santander operates in the U.S. Again, huge number of branches. And banks like Deutsche Bank were big players in the subprime market in the state of Ohio in the U.S. So all of these banks are international. They're operating in the sense of making loans, taking deposits, and buying assets on both sides of any given border. So that's point number one. Second, which is a more subtle point, is many of these banks have international ownership, but it's skewed to U.S. owners of equities. And I have to be careful about saying that because what that really means in a very strict legal sense is that the first owner of the equity is a U.S. domiciled entity, but the ultimate owner might be someone in Europe. So, for example, what the British call unit trusts and what we call mutual funds in the U.S. Are the major vehicle for buying stock in European corporations, including the banking industry, but we don't really know what's behind that. And to put some numbers out, banks like BNP Paribas, one of the biggest French banks, approximately 40% of its equity float is owned by U.S. entities. Deutsche Bank, about 25% of its equity is owned by U.S. entities. So point number two, it's not just that the banks operate internationally, but their ownership is international. If you were a Marxist, what this would make you think of is Karl Kautsky's work on ultra-imperialism. And then the third thing, of course, is that what we were talking about initially, which is that these banks necessarily have to be involved in international business, because if the bulk of German companies generate a trade surplus with the U.S., they have to do something with those dollars. They put those dollars into the German banking system, and then that banking system has to find some place to loan those dollars out. So when you look at international finance, it actually is international. There are really no more national banks in terms of looking at big banks. And this is why the Fed was quite quick to bail out not only American banks, but also European, Japanese, et cetera, banks. And And that had a functional component to it, but it also had this political and high level of integration component. The functional component was that the European banks needed dollars because they had made loans in dollars, they had taken deposits in dollars, and when the value of the asset, which in this case is the mortgage-backed securities or the mortgages, collapsed, they were left with lots of liabilities and not so many assets, but all denominated in dollars. The ECB could not provide them with those dollars. So the Fed had to provide dollars to the global banking system, usually through national central banks. But it did so not because it was feeling generous towards America's friends in the rest of the world, but rather because there's no way to disentangle these banks. And also because, frankly, again, Americans own big chunks of these banks, and so it matters for the richer 1% of America or the rich 10% of America.
And that really points out the centrality of the dollar.
Yes.
And the hegemony of the dollar.
Yes.
How should we think about that conceptually?
Right. Well, there's two ways to think about that. One I think is wrong-ish, and one I think is right. The wrong-ish way is to say, well, you need to have some kind of global currency to facilitate trade and investment. And that's kind of correct, and it's true that the dollar, by virtue of the fact that it is connected to very big, deep, liquid financial markets, for the Treasury bond, for example, but also to commercial lending in the U.S., makes it easy to do transactions in the dollar. And that's, I think, right-ish, but also wrong-ish. And the reason that it's wrong-ish is the things that I mentioned before about the nature of integration in the financial system. So I think the stronger way or the better way to think about the centrality of the dollar is that the U.S. Operates a kind of global empire. Like all empires, not all parts of the global economy that the empire is connected to are necessarily happy about it. Not all of them are fully integrated with it. The trade war with China is the best example of that today. But all the major players are deeply integrated. The Canadian economy, deeply integrated into the U.S. economy. Europeans, less so, but in many ways deeply integrated financially and functionally, with firms, U.S. firms operating in Europe and European firms operating in the U.S. Again, cocktail party statistic, the largest exporter of cars from the U.S. out to locations outside of North America is BMW. So everyone is integrated into this. And in this empire or quasi-empire, there has to be some kind of state money that operates to tie together all of these different parts of the empire. And the reason that you need state money is that banks, when they create credit, have a natural tendency to over-create credit. And they're, in some sense, in a competitive race to over-create credit. The more credit they create, the bigger their market share. The bigger their market share, the bigger the bonuses for the bankers. But the danger here is that they over-create credit and create a crash. So crashes are built into the system, and we've seen that in the 1990s and, of course, 2000s. When the crash happens, someone's got to bail out the banks. And the someone is the state, because the state can create money out of nothing. And in some sense, when it creates money, it's creating a liability for the state. But the asset that backs that liability is the ability of the state to tax its own economy and, in some invisible ways, tax the economies of other parts of the empire. Now, that's a long way of saying that when countries run trade surpluses with the U.S. as a national entity, what they're doing is giving American citizens stuff. That's great. We love your BMWs. We love your cheap Chinese lighting. We love your French wine. We love our vacations in Tuscany. So we get stuff because of these trade surpluses. And what the rest of the world, which is the provinces, if I can put it that way, and sorry, Europeans, Canadians, for putting it that way, but the Canadians, I think, will understand this. The provinces get pieces of paper that are claims on the future production of the U.S. economy. And so this is the way that the U.S. Has an ability to tax the rest of the world to create the offsetting asset when it creates the liability of the money that's used to bail out banks. So the US dollar functions as a money for the empire in a way that other currencies basically don't.
And this is what allows basically the USA to run massive current account deficits.
Yes. And the political side of that out in the provinces, again, if I can use that language, is the fact that the institutional structure and the economic structure of the major exporting economies, and again, exporting in the sense of trade surplus, gives a lot of power to export firms. And these firms are very unwilling to change the institutional structure that makes it possible for them to have high levels of exports. So the Chinese, up until about 2010, for example, did massive manipulation of their currency to make sure that the renminbi, the yuan, did not rise against the dollar and therefore damage China's ability to export. But what this also meant was China gave America billions of or trillions of dollars of goods, again, in exchange for promises that maybe in the future they would get something. And this diminished consumption by Chinese citizens. And likewise, the Germans have given billions of dollars of goods to the Americans in exchange for pieces of paper, which limits the consumption possibilities for German citizens. And these are political outcomes. This is a function of German export industry pressuring the state to and pressuring unions to keep wages low, to keep the euro, to enter the euro at a relatively undervalued exchange rate, so German exports would have a competitive advantage in world markets, to make it difficult for Germans to consume more by limiting access to mortgage money, to go back to something we were talking about at the beginning. So the institutional structure of these export surplus economies orients them towards maintaining this system because the winners in those societies are the export industries. Changing that, therefore, is very difficult. It's not simply a matter of Angela Merkel waking up one morning and saying, wow, we've got a problem. We run a trade surplus of 8% of GDP. We take the money we earn from that, we invest it in world markets, we get horrible returns. Little known fact is that the German overseas investments underperform those of Portugal in terms of rates of return. We get a horrible return on that, and meanwhile our citizens are suffering from lousy train service and deteriorating infrastructure. Maybe we should do something about that. The problem she faces in putting that out as a message is that the automobile industry, which is 20% of German manufacturing employment, and the chemicals drug industry, and the entire machinery industry would rise up in revolt, and she would have serious political problems. And it's not just the industries, it's also, of course, the workers in those industries.
And you've published a piece on this where you point out the old economy, the new economy, and the percentage of profits in the old economy, the new economy. And the USA also leads in the new economy, and Germany tends to predominate in the old economy. So does that mean that the German growth model is, well, close to its sell-by date?
The strong claim here would be yes, it's close to its sell-by date. And the one sentence, which I'm happy to expand on, would be Germany is a trade-dependent economy that exports goods from the 1900s automobile revolution, but we're living in the 21st century, in the 2000s now, in which the bulk of profits are going to what we think of as tech, but more broadly are industries that have strong intellectual property rights, and in which the trade system might well, if not collapse, at least contract. So the German economy and German export industry face some really serious problems here.
And the European economy more broadly then?
Yes and no. And the no is that if you look at different European economies, you see different patterns because, of course, Europe is a continental economy, just like the U.S., and there's a lot of different things going on. Ireland, as a center of software development and pharmaceuticals, is in a very different position from Germany as a producer of automobiles. The technological revolution around information communications technology, which, by the way, is actually also coming to an end, has certainly benefited Ireland in a way that it has not benefited Germany. You see efforts in Germany to respond to this. So a company like Siemens, which used to be split 80-20, 80% production workers, 20% engineers, is now actually very much the reverse, 80% engineers, 20% production. But many companies have not been able to make this kind of transition. And so, for example, if you're a German producer of piston rings or machinery to bore holes in engine blocks, you're in a very difficult position as we see electrification of the car fleet occurring. And you're also in a difficult position because you're enmeshed in a value chain in which more and more of the value is captured by suppliers of electronics and software. So, for example, software and electronics are now approximately 20 to 25% of the value of a car. And that number is only going to rise with electrification. So Germany, is it at its sell-by date? I wouldn't write them off, but I think there's going to be a very, very difficult transition, and one that will probably involve substantial loss of what the Germans think of as high-quality jobs.
So the picture that I see in front of me now is, on the one hand, a global economy that's deeply interconnected, both in terms of finance and both in terms of international supply chains, production chains, and so forth. And different countries, regions, cities can pull out value-added components of that. But whilst it might look like a broad network, really it's a structural imbalance with America fundamentally sitting at the peak.
Yes, the best way to think about this is, yes, that it's a network, but it's a network with a hierarchy. And again, I would be cautious about saying the U.S. I would say a large number of firms that are tightly integrated with the U.S. government and which theoretically are domiciled in the U.S. or effectively domiciled in the U.S. Are at the center of this hierarchical network. But it also includes many other firms that are not technically U.S. firms. And the two ways to understand that, again, are that there's very high levels of U.S. equity ownership of many of the leading firms in Europe and also, of course, Canada. But also, even when there are firms that don't have high levels of U.S. equity ownership, like Volkswagen, they're very dependent either on direct or indirect sales driven by the U.S. current account deficit. VW has a relatively small share of the U.S. market, but VW is very dependent on the Chinese market. The Chinese market, in turn, historically has been dependent on a trade surplus with the U.S. So even firms that are not owned by the U.S. Have some connection to this system.
So what matters here fundamentally are large global multinational firms, of which of course are made up of smaller firms connected together internationally through different supply chains.
Yeah, so two things here. So McKinsey did a lovely study. They won't release the data to people like me for reasons that aren't clear, but McKinsey did a lovely study, 33,000 firms with sales over $1 billion annually from the period 1994 to 2016. What they discovered was, out of these 33,000 firms, about 5,700 firms made approximately all the profits. And within those 5,700 largest firms, 20% of firms got 80% of the profits. So profitability, which ultimately is what drives capitalist economy, is highly concentrated. And these are the firms we're talking about when we say there's a network of power that centers on the U.S. state and U.S. firms. So that's point number one. Point number two is that when we talk about multinational corporations, I think in our imaginary, we have this vision of a unified corporation, everybody pulling together for the team, one monolithic entity. But for legal reasons, this is not the case, and actually for all sorts of reasons like tax avoidance and regulatory arbitrage, what multinational corporations really are collections of corporations that are each individually chartered in the relevant country. And this makes for some interesting complications. So, the famous ones being nominally American firms like Google or Apple, parking the bulk of their profits in Irish in subsidiaries that technically are chartered in Ireland but not domiciled there for tax purposes. And that's why I have said, well, theoretically it's the US and it looks like a US empire, but it's actually a hierarchical network of very powerful corporations with political allies. And those political allies have concerns that are greater than the economy. They also have security concerns. But fundamentally, the bulk of this network is mostly US companies. And of course, the US state is the most powerful from a military point of view. And the US dollar is the state money for this system. That's why we can speak of it as a US empire.
Interesting. So to bring it back to the European political economy for a moment, there's a debate raging in Europe at the moment about competition law. So on the one hand, in the USA, in China, you have the facilitation, ultimately, of large firms. It's considered to be an efficiency gain if a big company emerges, swallows up other companies, and generates into a big agglomerate, where the law and the kind of traditional culture in Europe is to use the legal system to break up companies. But what you're suggesting in real politics is that Europe is never going to be competitive in this space because it doesn't have the capacity to scale up.
I would say that there's a tension here, and the tension is that to compete, Europe needs big companies. But that, yes, the antitrust tradition and the Ordo liberal tradition in Germany, to the extent that that's spread to the rest of Europe, does run counter to this concentration. So we do see big companies in Europe like Airbus that essentially are operating a monopoly. And I don't see any proposals from someone like European Commissioner Vestager to break up Airbus. She's more than happy to attack Facebook and Google, which are American companies. So yes, there's a tension there. The bigger problem for Europe, however, is that the big economies, or the Northern European economies that have intellectual and political dominance in the EU, which is Germany and its, and again, sorry to my Danish and Swedish friends, its satellite economies like Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands, Belgium, Austria, and parts of Eastern Europe. This is where the political power is. These economies are oriented towards suppressing domestic demand to generate export surpluses, and that's the fundamental problem. This creates slower growth. So again, if we say, here's Germany, 8% of GDP surplus on its current account, normally this would create an economy that would look like it was on methamphetamine or cocaine in terms of growth. But the German economy has been growing more slowly than the U.S. economy, which runs trade deficits and therefore should be growing more slowly because of the drag on growth from having an import surplus rather than an export surplus. That's the bigger problem on European growth. And because European growth is slower than the US, and because Germany has exported its austerity model to the rest of the EU, companies that want to start up in Europe face a slow growth environment, and it makes it difficult for them to emerge, and it makes it difficult for them to grow once they emerge. That's the bigger problem than antitrust as such.
So thinking about the future of European integration, if you had a magic wand and you were a benevolent technocrat with real influence and power, what would you suggest to European policymakers?
Oh, yeah, I'm going to bail out on that question. First of all, I make so many trips to Europe, I have to be careful. I don't want to be stopped at the border. No, I mean, it is in fact not completely obvious. The reason it's not completely obvious is that we are at the end of the information communications technology revolution. There's a lot of high hopes for artificial intelligence, but you can see this, and also for the Internet of Things, you can see this as the last big growth spurt from that cluster of innovations that started in the 1950s, 1960s. A really forward-looking policy would address those industries, of course, but it would also address the biosciences, because the biosciences are the next new thing. And that's connected to AI because you need a lot of computing power to figure out the shape of proteins and do other kinds of processing. But it's the biosciences that really are the big breakthrough. And one way to understand that is to say, how many more people are going to buy cars? The answer is not very many. even if cars become autonomous, there will not be much growth in the car market. Where's the growth? What do people care about in the rich economies? They want to live longer lives. They want to live healthier lives. 20% of the US economy is health, although a lot of that is wasted. Health is the single biggest expense of most European states. This is where you're going to see massively growing demand on a lot of big scientific breakthroughs. So if I were sitting in Brussels trying to figure out where to spend my research money, I would be putting it into the biosciences. But again, that also requires an institutional structure to take up that funding. And so this would require a massive overhaul of the university system in a lot of European countries. Now, not to speak my book and your book in the sense that we're both academics, but I'll hasten to add, on the wrong side of the science-humanities divide, so it won't help us all that much. What this would mean would be increased funding for the sciences, increased funding for science students, lower tuition to encourage people to go into these fields, a bit more competition among faculty members. It is a reality that a lot of European academics, you excluded, of course, are actually quite content to live quiet, boring lives, doing not much. So there's a need to fix the university system, and it's not just a need to introduce more competition, but also to introduce more funding.
Well, Mark, on that point, I think we can most definitely agree. And thank you for this conversation. It's been fascinating.
Thank you, Aidan. Glad to be here.